Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this third and last day of the FIC forum. If there was a subject to keep for last, it's this one: securing generative AI, a matter of urgency. First of all, here are the figures. Over 1 in 2 employees uses generative AI in a professional setting. But according to a study from the conference board, only 1 out of 4 organizations has a formal framework put in place to about its use. Behind each prompt and use of generative AI are real risks, whether data leaks, reliance on vendors, algorithm hallucinations. My name is Iman Daou. I'm a manager in cybersecurity and data protection at SIA, and I'm happy to be moderating this roundtable today with 5 experts who will be able to complement each other's visions. So today we have Vincent Marais, Florence Mottet, Charlotte Barrault, Tom Martin-Rolofs, and Julien Richard. Today we're not just doing an technical overview, but we intend to delve deep into the subject to try and understand and support this revolution without sacrificing security, sovereignty, or trust. So, to begin, my first question, which might seem simple, is at the intersection of innovation, risk management, and certain tensions. How to encourage experimentation, how to innovate quickly without opening Pandora's box, without going too far or too early. So first, Vincent Marais, you are a partner at KPMG France, where you head up the company's cybersecurity activities, and you wrote a reference document on the risks associated with emerging technologies. In your work, you make a distinction between 2 risk families, those without malicious intent and those linked to a deliberate desire to cause harm. So, in terms of generative AI, how do you see this distinction changing the way we assess and anticipate threats? Thank you. Indeed, in the last few years, we've seen a certain number of incidents. For example, Amazon's AI that discriminates against women because of certain biases. All of us have been able to test ChatGPT and have witnessed hallucinations or errors. This is intrinsically linked to machine learning algorithms and neural networks, but there are no malicious intentions. It's a problem that's intrinsic, that's linked to these technologies. So we have to think that if today and in the future AI provides value, what history has taught us is that some people are evil or malicious in this world, and will try and either obtain this value, and that's what has brought about, for example, ransomware or certain societies that have gone bankrupt. And in academic research, there are hundreds, thousands of articles coming out every year that describe attacks against AI. And, well, these are researchers, so they're there to state facts, to warn about risks. There's, for example, data poisoning, inserting hidden entries in AIs, adversarial content, prompt injection with generative AI, data theft, model extraction. All these at the moment are something that's talked about in the academic setting, but in the future, these could lead to to new ways of malice. And certain companies that are currently experimenting and will put in place AI to improve processes that generate value, they'll have to prepare for this, understand that there are techniques linked to these algorithms and new technologies, and that tomorrow or in the future can lead to malice. So it's important to think about this and start protecting ourselves. So thank you, Vincent, for this distinction, which forces us to look beyond classical attack scenarios. There's another form of risk, perhaps more insidious, that is linked to data itself, its nature, and sensibility. So Charlotte, you are an AI expert. You've been working on these gray areas at the CNIL for several years. In December, the European Data Protection Authorities issued an opinion on the legal nature of AI models. And in one context can this was this opinion issued? And can an AI model still be considered anonymous or neutral if it has been trained using personal data? Thank you, Iman. Thank you for inviting me here today. So indeed, this question of the legal status of an AI model, wondering if an AI model is personal data, that's how we talk to describe this. Well, it's a different way to ask the question about model security. Asking ourselves if there are risks, and instead of seeing AI models under the prism of cybersecurity, we can also just wonder if an AI model is anonymous and confidential by nature, instead of wondering if when there's an attack there's privacy loss. We should ask ourselves, is an AI model by default confidential? And in the end, well, it can change status and lead to loss of personal data. And well, if you take the GDPR, the legal qualification of these models as personal data or not will lead to these models having to respect the GDPR. And so in December, the data protection European authorities released an opinion that may seem simple but was quite complex, and asking if an AI model should be considered anonymous by default, and if therefore the privacy issue is and so they decreed that it wasn't the case, and AI by default we should be able to show that there's a certain level of security, and the security measures of the model are linked to its legal qualifications. So a very secure model for which we were able to demonstrate that there are no private data loss can be accepted, but it's not by default. So what Vincent was saying, with AI models, it's not simply attacks from IT experts that lead to risks for privacy loss, but simply by using the model, by writing prompts, non-malicious prompts. So by keeping these risks in mind, these risks that are well documented, that are possible, so via attacks, malicious attacks, but also just in regular usage. Thank you, Charlotte, for your answer. So, as you mentioned before, talking about technology, we have to talk about qualification, framework, responsibility. And so this notion of a framework is at the very heart of the work done by the British Standards Institution. So Julien Richard, you represent BSI today, one of the founding pillars for ISO standards. You support multiple organizations in their implementation of governance frameworks applied to AI. And in a context where organizations are faced sometimes with contradictory injections, what can standardization contribute to structuring responsible use of generative AI? Thank you, Iman. Very happy to be here today. So a key word for me is standardization. It can be a bit of a scary word. So I'd like to reconcile risk management in companies with standardization. Especially in France, this is not necessarily seen as a positive thing. So the challenge for us at BSI is to reconcile companies with this idea of standards and standardization as a tool that allows us collectively, because standards are not just the work of one group, but they're made collectively. So standardization should have an interest to go beyond things like geopolitical issues. So standards, some ISO standards. So to me, it's supranational. It goes beyond the national level. And I'm sure we'll be hearing about it soon. Because when talking about standardization, we're talking about an approach, whether social, environmental. Today we're talking about AI. We've worked on this a lot at BSI, sometimes with certain local authorities or with CNIL and other companies that are here at the FIC. So these aren't necessarily administrative standards like the ones we might have in our daily life. The goal is to protect organizations, help them with new risk governance, anticipate them, and be resilient towards evolutions or from attacks, or of which there are new ones every day. So the point of the standard is to allow companies to have means of detection and to put in place certain criteria for protection in order to become resilient and reassure the regulatory authorities as well as consumers. So when you use a product, you like to know what you're using. If you think about cars, for example, we're thinking, well, cars get tested. It's the same thing for AI products. If tomorrow you start using a certain AI product, you prefer knowing that there's a certain level of security in certain aspects than the contrary. So the goal is to reassure consumers and be a partner for innovation. We want to help companies in their strategy. So it's also a business factor, and I'll come back to it when we talk about ISO 42001.
So thank you for reminding us that standards can help reassure. And that brings me now to you, Florence Mutti.
Of Information Security and CISO at Zalando. You lead security strategy for one of Europe's most digitally advanced fashion platforms. Zalando is not only a retailer, it's a tech powerhouse with over 3,000 engineers shaping the future of personalized commerce. From conversational AI that enhances customer journey to large-scale internal tools, your teams are actively embedding Gen AI into the very fabric of the company's operations. And rather than resisting, you choose to guide, building a security framework, fine-tuning models on over 85,000 prompts, and deploying a judge LLM to evaluate outputs. My question is that in such a bold and fast-moving environment, how did you manage to turn governance into a force of enablement for innovation?
Thank you, Iman, and good morning, everyone. So to answer your question, let me take you back to the end of 2022, at the moment where all of a sudden Gen AI became a thing, and that came through the rise of ChatGPT, of course. You said it rightly, Zalando is a technical company. Not many people know it, but it's really a tech company that happens to work in fashion. And so all of a sudden, we had all these business teams coming up with ideas. How can we improve our customer experience leveraging Gen AI? And one of those ideas was an AI assistant, which we called the Zalando Assistant, that helped customers find the right outfit, no matter the occasion. And so early 2023, the team started to work on this full speed. And they gave us a call, right, as they should. They said, hey, security, can you help us? And so we had been preparing for it. We were not fully ready, but we took on the challenge, of course. And as we started with our threat model and regular methodology, we realized that we were facing the usual security and privacy risks. But there were also additional things that we were not usually dealing with. Biases, misconfigurations, hallucinations, things that Charlotte also mentioned. And so that's when we realized that we had to work even more closely with the business than we already did. And it was worth it because we found a lot and we fixed a lot before the Zalando Assistant launched. As you mentioned as well, one of the remediation techniques that we used was 85,000 prompts that we classified. Business, not business, malicious. And the non-business is important because, again, as Charlotte and Vincent mentioned as well, it's not all about attacks. Sometimes it's something that is inherently wrong with the model or with the application. And so to date, this classifier is still used as one of the layers to validate the prompts that we receive. And so this was a first step, but it was only the first step. Since then, we've done a lot. We actually have a complete methodology for AI and for Gen AI in particular. And it's something that we use day in and day out with our teams. And so the reason why I think it was successful is really one word. It's collaboration. Because the Zalando Assistant was the first Gen AI customer-facing application that we launched. And so we all learned, right? The business team, the security team, the engineering team, we learned together. And we were a real partner in that effort. We really, we followed our methodology, of course, but we were a partner in finding issues, in making sure that we were fixing issues as well. And so for me, having that collaboration is really what opened the door for other teams to reach out to us when they wanted to leverage Gen AI.
Thank you, Florence. What you've shown us is that with the right methodology and frameworks, it's possible to empower teams without compromising control. But in other sectors, especially in banking, the constraints are different, right? The stakes are higher, the regulatory scrutiny is constant, and the risk tolerance is far lower. Tom Martin Roloffs, as the Global Head of Security, Strategy and Data at ING, you operate with one of the most scrutinized and regulated sectors, international banking. ING has always been at the forefront of digital transformation, yet your approach to Gen AI has been deliberately cautious. So there are limited usage, tightly controlled environment, and deep risk assessment before deployment. While traditional AI is already part of your detection and defense strategies, Gen AI introduces a new layer of unpredictability. In such a high-stakes environment, how do you strike the right balance between the need to innovate and the responsibility to prevent cascading systemic side effects?
Thank you, Iman, and good morning all. Indeed, I'm working at the bank, and I lead, amongst others, also a team of data scientists. So they develop models to improve our security. So a lot of the comments that I will make is really from that angle. So we don't produce models where customers can correspond to, that are open to poisoning in a very direct sense. And I think, Iman, you described it well. So if you look with a searchlight very carefully, like what is our current usage of Gen AI for security, this is really rather limited. So we do, of course, look at it. Closer to the... Okay, sorry. Hope everybody understood it so far. So the usage of Gen AI is really limited. We do look at it because, of course, there's interesting perspectives. And then you have to think about, for instance, enriching alerts that come out of our detection to get a further context. Or, for instance, slightly different angle. So if you get new regulations, they tend to be very elaborate, long texts. Also overlapping with other parts of regulations. So we're, for instance, looking at, can we make generative models that can summarize the text with a high quality, of course, and also link towards existing regulations and controls that we already implemented. So it's really to, let's say, improve the speed at which we can look at the new things and also provide feedback if we're asked for feedback on a regulation that is in development. So Gen AI is really limited, and an important factor there is, of course, the precision. For security within the bank, you want to have high precision. And I think all my esteemed panelists already alluded to it. So if you have an hallucination, ChatGPT throwing some weird words at you, or maybe generating a picture with where somebody has like 6 fingers, that's not a problem. It's juste pour rire. But for security, it's nothing to laugh about. So we don't want to depend on this with our really critical fields of vulnerability management, of detection. Having said that, it's still a technology that has some promises. I'm not sure whether, if we talk about generative AI and then LLMs, the technology by itself, the way the model is built, that we will ever get to really a serious positioning in security. So we're not overestimating in that sense. But our journey then, within the bank, it's even, there's a nice slide on it with a very long journey, because it's in contrast to many companies that can that have like the motto move fast and break things fast. This is not for a bank, obviously. So the whole journey is, well, starting with risk analysis. If you develop models, penetration testing it, there's like assessments on possible leakage of personal data. So that whole journey is quite a journey, I have to say. So we're putting effort into it, but I think the most of the efforts are still traditional AI in that sense, so machine learning. And where I do see, and we can have maybe a nice conversation about it, where I do see practical applications is, for instance, in data leakage prevention, because that's also a lot of the assessments, a lot of the checks that we do in security are quite technical, like connections and IP addresses and accounts, etc. But LLMs, the real strong side of LLMs is, of course, that it can have a fairly good grasp into what a text is about. And with data leakage prevention, that can be a very interesting use case.
Indeed, thank you, Tom. Alors, nous venons de parler de risque.
Right, we've just spoken about risk and innovation, but governance isn't something that can be handed down from above. It has to be builded, and this means clarifying roles, responsibilities, and sometimes also the boundaries between two legal systems, that of compliance and that of security. So, Charlotte, the European Regulation on Artificial Intelligence, the AI Act from March 2024 introduces a risk-based approach. And what we'd like to understand today is how has this approach of security by and for humans, how is that different from the classical approach of the GDPR? And how can these two frameworks serve as complements to each other rather than contradicting each other? It's a general question which allows me to take a look at the regulations. The AI Act has a risk-based approach in two ways. It classifies different levels of risk with different requirements in terms of the risk levels. Yes, can you hear me? Sorry. And so this classification according to the level, and also it's an approach to product security. And as Julien said about the standards in the AI Act, there's a notion of harmonized standards. The principle of this sort of regulatory approach is to facilitate the integration of the regulations into industry by providing a certain number of guarantees of compliance. And this is something quite new for tools which might be considered information systems. Classically, this sort of approach is used for products, for electric sockets, or in aeronautics, but here we're talking about information systems. So the whole new approach is that the information system becomes a certified product subject to requirements. And what's new here is these harmonized standards are the basis of this compliance. So it's mandatory to apply them before you deploy or even develop a product. So there's this security even before design, which is very important, with requirements which are incumbent on the supplier and not just on the person who is deploying it. And so this serves as a complement to the the regulation on personal data, which doesn't target a specific type of technology. It applies to any technology which includes personal data. Hence the question of deciding whether this is personal data. So all high-risk systems which have been trained on personal data or which are deployed and contain personal data, so this might be AI models in health, for example. Most of them contain sensitive data, sensitive personal data, and so the regulations serve as complements to each other. So there we don't have this compliance. In the GDPR, we don't have this pre-marketing compliance. It's more post-market inspection and perhaps sanctions, even though there are a certain number of support mechanisms in place. And also some provisions which I would call pre-market. We deliver research authorizations in health, and the development of an algorithm in health is considered or is deemed to be research in health. So we have a certain number of operations like this of compliance And to understand the difference between the two, the GDPR, data protection, is a regulatory approach which is in terms of individual rights, privacy, confidentiality, the approach of having the possibility for each individual to dispose of their data. Personal data should not just be used on any terms. We have a right to access to the information. So it's a question of transparency. And this transparency with the user also features in the AI Act. In particular, for the requirements for generative AI, there are documentation requirements. There are also requirements to inform the person interacting with the AI that it is AI. So there is this notion of transparency, very similar to the GDPR. However, the AI Act also addresses another risk of systemic risks, which don't just concern confidentiality, but also concern explicability and also requirements of recording, of traceability. And we need to understand that in one case we're talking about a product, and in the other we're talking about the consequences for people whose data is integrated in one way or another into the model. And we know with generative AI, when we have photographs trained on images of people or on texts written by people and containing information about them, or even the voices, there are more and more models trained on people's voices. This is a growing issue, and which is at the intersection between the protection of personal data. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Charlotte. We do see this notion of transparency that remains central and important. Julien, at BSI, you were involved in the publication of ISO 42001, the first international standards dedicated to AI governance. This standard, well, we can say it's ambitious, and can ask ourselves if they can be applied they can apply to all organizations, all companies, or at this stage, wouldn't it be targeted to companies that are already technologically advanced? In other words, is it possible today to democratize excellence in AI governance by targeting any kind of organizations that would want to be involved with this technology? Thank you very much for this question. Good news. We can say that there is a democratization in practice today, and in a anxiety-inducing context around these AI subjects, companies, well, there are some constraints for companies, but as Charlotte was saying, in a regulatory context for certain organizations, even though at the moment there's no automatic link between EU regulations and this ISO standard, for companies that develop AI or for which implementing these solutions would have a big impact, I believe that it would be essential in terms of business or CSR to demonstrate that they are doing things the right way. But the standard is also can also be targeted to smaller companies, SMEs. And a lot of organizations want to demonstrate that they are moving towards innovation in a responsible way. So before necessarily talking about AI by design, well, we have to ask ourselves, how does an AI product get created? We have to ask ourselves a certain number of questions in order to put in place these products that are compatible with certain questions linked to the ecological transition, climate change, So to go back to uses, yes, this ISO standard has helped with responsible usage and the goal is to be integrated in governance. So yeah, BSI is a certification organization, but so for the companies certified to this standard would accept an external perspective on the measures they've taken, on the decisions they've made initially, between conception and what is actually being implemented. And for example, in the medical sector, that we work with quite often, and you as consumers, I'm sure, are happy to know that these companies are tested and secured. So in this context, in this medical field, we are able to differentiate companies that have this responsible approach and accept external controls and audits. For example, for companies that would want to operate in Europe, they'll need to demonstrate that they respect certain regulations. And this certification is also a tool for communication between companies beyond the national level in order to transform the companies and have products that meet the expectations of the consumer. So yes, the standard is for all companies and to demonstrate a responsible engagement in terms of AI. Thank you, Julien. Thank you for reminding us that this standard is inclusive, that the goal isn't to exclude certain companies or organizations that are smaller or less mature. Florence, at Zalando, you've made this governance collective reflex.
Job of one team, but a collective responsibility. And yet, in most organizations, governance still feels like a silo, or worse, a compliance checkbox. What did it take at scale to make this shared accountability truly operational at Zalando? And how do you ensure it stays transformative rather than performative?
Thank you, Iman, for this question. So I'm going to take you back to the end of 2022 again, because with the rise of Gen AI, the launch of ChatGPT, I mentioned that ideas were floating everywhere when it comes to supporting our customer experience. But I wasn't only externally, right? We also had a lot of folks internally who had great ideas on how to leverage Gen AI. And so we saw an influx of ideas just coming through. In parallel, in December 2022, the European Council confirmed the adoption of the general direction towards the AI EU Act. And so for us, the timing was perfect. We thought, oh, awesome. We can actually promote innovation and empower our teams while preparing for the regulatory landscape ahead. And so we really took that as an opportunity to put together a governance working towards that AI Act, and at the same time, helping to manage the volume of ideas and use cases that were coming to us. So in 2023 and 2024, we put together a very strict process to do both these things. And so that process involves a lot of people, to your point. It's not the job of one team. It's a mix of applied scientists, of legal experts, security experts, procurement experts, and all of the use cases go to that team. And so first, of course, there is a review. Is there an AI product or a model within Zalando that can be leveraged, or does it need to be something new? And if it needs to be something new or even something existing, what additional checks, if any, do we need to do? What controls do need to be put in place, and so on. So this resulted in something very formalized and structured. Today, if you're a Zalando employee and you want to experiment with Gen AI, there is a process, and we're here to help. And for me, the reason why this works and why this is really something that has taken life is that ability to have that win-win situation where, yes, there is a governance, there is a process, but we also promote innovation. So everybody feels heard, and there is that balance between the two.
Merci Florence. Ce que vous montrez, c'est qu'il faut de la méthode, bien sûr.
Thank you, Florence. What you've shown is that it takes methodology, but also culture and strategic alignment at all levels of the organization. Vincent, you've alerted to a worrying problem, which is differentiated acculturation. So comics is try, business units experiment. So how to recreate a shared, lucid, and responsible vision of challenges posed by generative AI? And do you believe it is still possible to regain control over uses that are spreading outside of strategic frameworks? I believe that the key is to build collectively in the company to update the risk universe. We see that there are certain risks that are new or completely unexpected. So we live in a world, with a lot of IT, or very deterministic, with ERPs, things that need to be very precise, very specific, databases where everything is organized. And then we have this UFO with generative AI, which can sometimes produce things that are incredible, that could come from someone who's doing a PhD, and then with the next prompt is making the kind of mistakes that a child would make. So I think there is a need to update this risk universe. And so in addition to phishing or data poisoning, there's also, I was talking about it earlier, there's also the risk of an AI system that generates hallucinations. So this needs to be taken into account depending on fields, depending on the companies. The risks will be different depending on the field you work in. So at some point, of course, it's still important to take risks, because by design, these AI are non-deterministic technologies. We have to accept that there will be a certain margin for error. So we're asking ourselves, what is an acceptable ratio? Are we able to take these AI models to an error ratio that is acceptable or not? There is also the question of acculturation, acclimatation, which is what Florent was saying. There is risk management. So, and there's a risk both ways if you do it or if you don't. So you can, by not adopting certain technologies, you can maybe not have access to certain clients or markets. And the Article 4 of the AI Act, there is a requirement to train employees that is very clearly defined. So obviously this will depend on on the target audiences. So, for example, data scientists, you don't necessarily need to explain to them what AI is, but it's important to inform them about the risks linked to what they're doing. So then there are certain jobs or sectors that are kind of the middlemen that need to be acclimated to AI, but also risks. And same for top management, where to me the risk for AI is already present or already being considered by top management. Thank you, Vincent. You've placed the cursor between acculturation and risk at the right place to make AI a lever for companies.
Model training become visible, like when LLM trained on silent red team attacks fail to detect loud ones. What does this reveal about the fragility of AI in real-world security operations, and what kind of governance, technical and human, must we put in place to restore trust in these systems?
Thank you. I have to mention then, sorry, it was not an LLM. It was a traditional decision tree that we trained, but anyway, but a very nice anecdote, I think, which is exemplary of the problem. Maybe first on explainability. So there are algorithms that work on the output of models and explain like how did the model come to its output. Like it was 20% this feature, 50% this feature, etc. So it gives you, let's say, a hint to why a model came to a certain conclusion. However, that's something different than really understanding the full training set on which it was trained. And this is, by definition, bigger data. Yeah, the understanding there is more statistical. It's never to the degree where we understand the full implication of possible combinations in that data set or exceptions. So I always have that conversation with my team, like, okay, how much do we understand of it? And this particular case happened when we had, let's say, the model working in parallel with our normal operations. And the model was trained on a red team attack that was quite silent. So to give you an idea, the red team produced around 2, 3, 4 alerts from various detection systems. And we trained the model on the whole landscape output. So in that confinement, in that space, that model worked perfectly. But then when a red team emerged that was suddenly very loud, it produced like 12 or 13 alerts, then suddenly we noticed that the model didn't identify it as an attack. Which is understandable if you realize that, yeah, the model it's a big decision tree like this Japanese ginkgo game, and at the end it says, well, it's an attack or not an attack. That also gives, let's say, the importance of knowing your model, knowing the extremes of the model, knowing the constraints. And in terms of the governance, I think it's very important. I always challenge my team on that, to have also a diverse team. So don't trust all the geeky data scientists with it. You have to look at it from like an exception perspective as well. Did we cover it? What did we train on? So to challenge that team again and again, and that will make, together with test. Really, it's a lot about testing, following it in practice, retraining. That makes, in the end, a model relatively predictable and well-functioning.
Thank you, Tom. So, do a lot of trainings and have diverse teams, right? Alors, nous avons beaucoup parlé de...
We've talked a lot about governance, responsibility, use frameworks, but the real strategic question might not be that. The real question might be how we get top general management on board. So my question here is for you, Julien. Julien, aside from the technical requirements, today there is a real need to convince the general management, the executive committees, that certification is not just an administrative burden, but really the core of a company's resilience. So how can we get these bodies to understand that standardization can be a vector of sovereignty and control in a technological ecosystem which is increasingly changing and becoming more and more opaque and interdependent? It's not easy. In fact, or it is, when we talk about regulation, people often see it as a necessary evil. But here, when we have a risk that might be environmental or that might be linked to AI, we do have to have some regulation which can have an impact on the business. Generally, the general management are going to be interested initially in the impact there might be in economic terms or in calls for tender, with a loss of competitive edge caused by certifications. This comes up in all different areas in information security with ISO 27001. The competitiveness of a certified company is perhaps doubled because we're in a context where there are big impacts of cyber risks and a lot of concerns. And what's important is this resilience. So if you imagine that in the future there might be lots of AI operators associated with large industrial groups that have economic responsibilities, some of which might be vital for us, vital operators managing programs where there's a purpose of innovation, productivity or efficiency, but which can also have an impact on us ourselves. And so what's going to motivate them is going to be that the regulator at state level, what they say in terms of the responsibility or accountability of companies in relation to different solutions. It's better to act upstream. Now we see the consequences of everything that wasn't done 30, 40 years ago in environmental matters, which now raises lots of questions because of a free market liberal approach. But today we are lucky with AI, as Charlotte said earlier, that we're thinking about the risks here, now, on the table. So what motivates management is the opportunity this might open up, or the opportunities that might be lost. And also we're lucky in this respect to be in Europe. And is also the dimension, the social dimension, because very clearly, in terms of image, I think it might be a problem if companies which are leaders on questions linked to artificial intelligence started rolling out solutions that might, for one reason or another, might potentially be ideal targets for cyber attacks, or might generate a lot of bad buzz because they have been slow to measure and to understand the risks. And then there's the question of transformation. I find that certified companies today have a capacity for improvement and upgrades and innovation, and there are ISO standards on innovation 55001. And the approach is to have the standards as a driver here. They're not gadgets. They're not something which is there actually just to win contracts. It's an intentional management approach. And when we come to the end customer, I think the customer tends to go towards companies which provide this assurance rather than others that might not, but which might have the most extraordinary innovations. So the notions of risk are very exacerbated today in society. And so I don't know whether the most attractive innovations, but which are lacking in governance, will necessarily be the most successful. So this certification is a business enabler and a driver of change, and it will perhaps be even more pronounced if the regulator adopts a more coercive approach, as we're seeing today with some of the standards, NIS2, DORA, and others. And on these questions of regulation, law sometimes struggles keeping up, and Charlotte, you know better than any of us, technologies are changing much more quickly than positive law. And in the face of this reality, we'd like to know how the CNIL can guarantee the protection of fundamental rights, but also support organizations in a virtuous process. In your opinion, what are the concrete conditions that are required for compliance no longer to be perceived as a constraint, but as a driver of responsible innovation? It's true that we may have this impression that there's a certain inertia because procedures in law and in legislation are much more cumbersome than in innovation. So in that respect, innovation can go more quickly. But I would like to express a caveat here, because when we see in data protection, for example, the way in which the text is written, insofar as it's technologically agnostic, it has a very broad scope and a certain robustness over time, no matter what the technological changes. The AI Act is written a bit in that way. Obviously, it is targeting more specifically AI, but I think many of you know it's a concept which is very broad and which is defined in a very elastic way sometimes, even though there are the links with the questions of deterministic or stochastic. So ultimately, we have this flexibility in the framework and regulations that allows this to be robust over time. Having said that, you're absolutely right. Innovation has always, we see that we always see the object exists and then we need to regulate it, and sometimes there are risks. When we react to the risks that are observed, and we therefore come up with regulations. So I think what we need, at least in our approach at the CNIL, we try to be at the top of the chain. We're seen as the police of personal data, but we also have a whole program of support, which is very important to us because it enables us to avoid risks or damage being caused. And so it's in the interest of the regulator, of civil society, and the companies as well, because it's very costly to their reputation and sometimes financially as well when there's a big data breach, as has been seen recently. So we really want to have this approach. There are several tools at our disposal to do this. We provide support and guidance. We do calls for projects, proposing to the public or to companies, innovative companies with high growth capital. We create a team, depending on the sector, on the health, banking, or whatever. At the moment, we are working with Dr. Post and Doctrine, which are these programs. We have programs where over a period of 6 months or a year, where we're at the table with them, they explain their processes to us on given projects, and we give them advice to make them as compliant as possible. So we try to have a dialogue and not an approach based on sanctions in this respect. It really is discussion and dialogue, with the aim being to foster compliance at the top of the chain, the start of the chain. Which brings us to the subject of the standards as well. And that's the whole interest of the AI Act. We have certification for the protection of data, but it's not a prerequisite of the text. GDPR compliance is not necessarily requires certification. It's a good practice. We talked about 27001 on confidentiality. It corresponds, it's not equivalent to the text, but it does correspond to some of the prerequisites for compliance and data protection. So the idea is to develop this sort of standard. We have some in health, but not in other sectors, and to try to identify the problems upstream through the risk-based approach of the AI Act to see what we're rolling out. If I roll this out, what will happen, and what are the risks for confidentiality, for security, for health, perhaps, or for autonomy? Yeah. So our aim really is to provide this support mechanism, and there's also a system we launched of sandboxes a couple of years ago, the same approach of support, but with a more forward-looking approach. These are projects which are not yet rolled out, and it's something we find in the AI Act, which makes provision for regulatory sandboxes to be put in place by the government. It hasn't been done so far in France, with the idea being potentially to provide conditions for testing in real conditions and to obtain certain exemptions for some processing of data. So that is a wonderful opportunity for companies to understand what they're going to be facing in terms of risk. Thank you. That's excellent. Thank you for that. All that work. Tom.
Embed AI into their solutions, and yet, as clients, you've pointed to the deep opacity surrounding these systems. If we want to trust these tools with our most critical infrastructure, what level of transparency should we expect, and how should organizations like ING test, validate, and perhaps even challenge AI-powered solutions before integrating them into security operations?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so assurance on whatever we use from third parties is a very important topic for ourselves, to be confident that we do the right stuff. But also in regard to regulations like DORA. So it's, and I'll try to give a very compact answer here. So can and should we know? Should we know? Yes. So we should have a proper level of understanding, because in the end we are accountable for the service that we offer. Can we understand it? Well, I won't repeat the problems that you have with like explainability of AI products by itself. There is also an interesting balance there between intellectual property from vendors versus the need for transparency. We see that a lot with security products. And also an interesting question is, and I can't give you the answer there straight directly, like should we know in the sense of is it a good thing that security products are very transparent in how they work? And so we see that with other products as well, like antivirus, that before you know it, you have an underground testing service that tests whether the antivirus products recognize your malware. So I think that's a very interesting mix. We haven't found the end answer there. We don't need to have the end answer now. But it will be a mix. It will be a mix of like certifications of the vendors, the reputation of the vendors, the testing that we have to do ourselves. And in the end, that should give the right level of assurance and the right level of reliability.
Thank you. However, we still have this growing opacity, the proliferation of tools, the increasing interdependence between systems, and this is what you've described as a kind of domino effect, Vincent. En effet, dans votre ouvrage, vous qualifiez certaines technologies d'accélérateurs de fragilité.
So you have described certain technologies as fragility accelerators. Generative AI, when combined with open APIs, invisible software dependencies, and cascading automation, can create systemic vulnerabilities that are difficult to reverse. How can we anticipate this domino effect on an ecosystem scale? Well, that's not an easy question. Indeed, we've had generative AI for 2 years now, so it is fairly simple. You have a prompt, it leads to content that's generated. Already today we have AI agents, so more complex AI systems. For example, in ChatGPT, Claude, DeepSeek, you have the functionalities to go interrogate the web, external tools, reflections, thinking chain of thoughts. And in the future, you'll be able to have AI agents with planification. So this increases the exposed surface, exposed area. So Anthropic, who is a software editor for Claude, has created a system that allows to make requests to external systems with LLMs. So a document came out that shows flaws in this protocol. So I can only call on users to be, well, I don't want to use the word prudent, because we shouldn't just stop everything, because then we can't continue to innovate. But it's important to integrate this risk-based approach from the very beginning, and as well as potential cyber malice. Because if it creates value, people will be trying to capture this value that are not necessarily well-intentioned. So when I was younger, I tried myself to break some systems, and I'm telling myself that, well, in the future, I'm sure a whole new generation of testers will have fun with these. Thank you, Vincent. So should we lock, prohibit, block? Florence, you've taken a different path.
Altogether, sorry about that. They choose to block out of fear, or maybe because of there is a lack of preparedness within the organization. But at Zalando, you choose another way, enablement with guardrails, right? You empowered teams, created internal governance pipelines, and developed models that can self-evaluate. Why does blocking feel to you like a failure of leadership? And what, in your experience, does it truly take to make trusted enablement a reality and not just a slogan?
Thank you, Iman. So let me start maybe with two clarifying points. The first one is, I explained earlier how we treat use cases coming mostly from engineering teams, right, who want to experiment. So that's one side. We have a strong governance, as I explained, and we also ensure that we promote innovation within guardrails. The second, though, is all of the different third-party applications that exist. So take a ChatGPT, a Mistral AI. Those are applications that are very common, that are very trendy. And so I'm going to focus on that part for the answer to this question. The second clarifying point is that I don't think it's a failure. I just don't think that it should be the norm to block, at least for a company like ours. And so let me explain to you what we decided. So first, there are some applications that we do block. It's not the norm, but there are some that just pose too much risk for the organization, and so we just do that. But for others, for those applications that are not necessarily authorized within the company, but also pose a risk that we think is manageable, we choose the avenue of education. And so that means a lot of training, guidance, a lot of time, a lot of effort. But for us, it's worth it, because this way we really empower people to make the right choices. Otherwise, I'm really convinced that if you block everything, folks will try and find an avenue to do it anyway, just without the right tools in hand. And so it's actually more dangerous. And there is one last point that I think is important there. If you educate folks and if you empower people to do things in the right manner, you also contribute to the bigger societal problem that is security. Because we all know it's not the problem of one company, of one country. It's really a problem that affects us all. And so we need to promote that education. And those folks that have been trained via Zalando, they'll be able to train others, their family members, and to make the right choices. So for me, it's also a way to help, right? Every little bit helps to promote security in the broader sense.
Merci infiniment, Florence. Nous voyons que c'est aussi un acte de courage.
Thanks, Florence, for your answer. So we're seeing that it is a collective act of courage. So we don't have much time left, but if you have one or two questions for our panelists. So unfortunately, we don't have anyone for the microphones. I can either give you mine or...
Small and medium companies, that's about 10 million people work there, so that's 1/3 of French workers. They have...
I'm sorry, we can't hear. The person isn't speaking into the microphone, so we cannot translate.
But we've seen, for example, DeepSeek that was totally open and we showed it, so I tell them that, but they start to be afraid of phishing, they start to understand that, but for AI, they put their professional, personal life inside, and as far as I know...
The sound quality is not enough for us to hear for the translation in the booth for the question. We'll translate the answer if we can hear it.
How can we tell people from very small companies for whom even $20 a month is a lot and they go to the free ones, is there like benchmarks of which one is totally open and which one is secured? How do we guide them? Quelqu'un veut prendre la question?
Does someone want to answer? I think there's many different ways to answer the question. I'll just say something on the certification part. We're at the very beginning of the process. We're in a new era. And some people might find it easier not to do it, and that is where regulatory authorities will have to play a key role, because for some organizations, they will not have a choice. They will need to get certificated. And so these AI can be used at different levels, simply by employees of the company, but also the company's clients, as well as their suppliers. So at some point, on certain specific solutions, that's why I was talking about a necessary evil earlier. Of course, you can only make some announcements once you've obtained the certifications, but it is made on a volunteer basis, and that's why I think this roundtable is very interesting, because we see, for example, the Zalando case, where they've seen that there was an interest to put in place responsible governance on these subjects outside of certification, but also in the relation to real-life uses. It can take time. Certain standards have taken 3, 4, 5 years to really take off, but with the AI Act, I think it'll be faster. Vincent? Yes, so today there are benchmarks that exist on what we call alignment. So the fact that a model generates or not toxic content is liable to jailbreaking, data loss, etc. So, for example, Claude from Anthropic, when put through these benchmarks, Claude seems quite resilient and DeepSeek a bit less. But all of this evolves very quickly, and these benchmarks are not necessarily the only truth, because they're based on an example, because on a finite list of examples. But there have been studies that show that when a benchmark was made out of a multiple answer quiz with A, B, C, D as responses that can change the performance of the LLM. So I think it's important to accept today that there is no perfect or definite answer to a lot of the problems posed by this generative AI. So it changes more than what you were saying. Is there another question?
I conduct security analysis for many clients, especially on AI systems, and there's a lot of complexity with all these ISO standards, security frameworks, NIST, OWASP, ANSI, etc., and also all new findings in research papers. And I wonder if you have any recommendations to overcome this complexity due to regulation, ISO standards, etc. etc.
Merci beaucoup. Quelqu'un aimerait prendre... Yes, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, what can I say? Common sense. What I always find interesting, as a bank, we have like this 3 lines of defense system. So I'm first line, we develop stuff, and then there's a second line challenging me, and a third line even. Sometimes they go in different directions, which I find very interesting, because I think it's all about the reliability and the effectiveness of the model. So we ourselves should also not be should be caring about what a model does and what the side effects are. So I think it's very important to have that understanding in the first line. So the guys and girls that build the models, and focus on these key questions. Sometimes I get a lot indeed of like red tape and very exotic questions, like where I think we could be important, but let's focus on the main points there. So yeah, I would endorse common sense.
Florence, you wanted to add something?
Maybe quickly adding to what you said, Martin. So I agree with common sense, and it all comes down to the why. So all of these standards, they're different, but their intention is usually the same. And so when we developed our security framework, we have a threat modeling methodology, a red teaming methodology, we covered the intent of all of these. And so I think that's something that we need to continue doing. Otherwise, we can get stuck in just the words or the way something is phrased.
Thanks.
Thank you. We can have another one. Une autre question, peut-être?
Are there other questions? Well, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to our panel.